Welcome to the online classroom on the module INV4801, Portfolio Management. This module is part of the modules for UNISA students studying for a BCom honors degree in financial management, and it's one of the optional modules. And basically, as the name says, it's about teaching you the important concepts and principles underlining managing an investment portfolio. Remember, when we talk about a portfolio or an investment portfolio, we're just talking about a group of assets that an investor invests in. So usually you might find that investors could have equities, like these are shares as part of the investments. They could have property. They could also have bonds. Bonds are also known as fixed income assets. So these are all examples of assets that an investor could have in their portfolio. So if we group all these assets together, we call that a portfolio. There are also what are known as alternative asset classes. Alternative asset classes, these would include items like hedge funds and other unique kinds of assets that investors can invest in. So this module is all about teaching you how to manage a portfolio of investments on behalf of an investor. And it's also important to note that when we talk about investors, there are different types of investors, right? An investor can be an individual, and an investor can also be an institution. So we can group investors into two types. These are just some things I think you need to know, so I'm just telling you, but we'll touch on them some more as we proceed. We usually group investors into two types of investors, right? We have two types of investors. We have what we call individual investors. So an individual investor would be someone like you if you are looking to invest in shares or bonds or other assets. And then we also have what we call institutional investors. Institutional investors. Now, institutional investors would be maybe pension funds or life insurance companies, general insurance companies, banks. Those are institutional investors, right? So institutions can also invest money. They can also invest money into bonds, shares, property, equity, alternative asset classes. And individuals can also invest money into shares, bonds, property, alternative asset classes. Okay. So the idea behind this module is just to teach you how individuals can manage their portfolios and how institutions can manage their portfolios, their collection of investments. And obviously, you'll find that even though individuals can invest in certain assets, they might not have the expertise to invest in some unique assets like property or shares or bonds or even commodities and so forth. So individuals are typically limited by a lack of expertise when it comes to invest, a lack of funds. Even if you're an investor and you've got money, the money you have won't be enough, won't be close to what institutions have. So you might find that institutions can find it easier to invest because they pull a lot of funds from different people, and that means they can hire people with expertise, and also because they have a lot of funds, they can get access to certain asset classes that individual investors might not have. Okay. And then lastly, an important concept is that you should note that individuals and institutions will usually hold portfolios because portfolios, which are a collection of investments, they offer diversification benefits, right? Portfolios have what we call diversification benefits. If you just invest in one asset, for example, shares in one company, there's a danger that if the company goes bankrupt or something happens to that company, you might lose all your investment. So rather, you'll find that people, individuals and institutions alike, will spread out their money to different investments, like invest in different shares in different companies, invest in different asset classes like shares and then property and then bonds, just to diversify their money and their investments such that they hold a portfolio. So portfolios are important because they offer some protection to institutions and investors. When you have money, you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, so to say. We shouldn't. That's why we don't call this module asset management, right? We call it portfolio management because we're talking about managing a group of assets. So the benefits of having a portfolio or group of assets is that you get diversification benefits. If you hold shares in 3 different companies, if one thing happens to one company, you can still benefit from, you can still be protected by investing in the 2 other different companies from the one company that went bankrupt. So we call that diversification. So you can diversify by asset class by holding different shares, or you can diversify by holding different shares, right? But you can also even diversify by holding different assets. For example, holding shares and also bonds and property. So should one thing happen to property in the market, it won't affect your bond holdings, your bond investments or your share holdings. Let's say there's a decline in the property market. Likewise, if there's a decline in the bonds market, if you also have shares in property, it won't affect your property and your shares. So the portfolio perspective is very, very important. And according to the handouts provided by your lecturer, you need to be able to justify the importance of the portfolio perspective. The portfolio perspective is very important. It's a way for an investor to minimize their risk by benefiting from diversification benefits. Okay, so now we can get to the notes. So we can actually talk about the portfolio management process in detail. Through this class, I'm going to take you through the first part of what we call the portfolio management process. Remember, we've said that this module that we're looking at, it's focused on managing investment portfolios. So this process, this whole idea of managing investment portfolios is actually a process. It's actually a process that consists of certain steps. And for the purposes of the exam, you need to be familiar with those steps. So portfolio management, so we're going to look at portfolio management. So portfolio management can be viewed as a process. We can view it as a process. So in other words, it's not a static step, it's actually a process. It's not a once-off event, it's something that's continuously happening. So portfolio management can be viewed as a process, and it's not a once-off event of just selecting assets and holding them till required. So when we talk about portfolio management, we're not simply talking about buying shares and property and bonds and then just holding them until you need to sell them to get your money back to use it for whatever you need to do. Rather, when we talk about the portfolio management process, when we talk about portfolio management, we're actually talking about a process known as portfolio management process, where we are just not simply buying assets and holding them until maturity and then selling them to get the money we need to then do whatever we want with it. Rather, the portfolio management process involves 3 steps, which will continuously happen over the course of the life of you holding a portfolio. So the 3 steps in the portfolio management process are: number 1, there's planning. This is the first step, and we're going to discuss this step in detail and also look at an example associated with the planning step. The second step is execution, and the third step is feedback. Okay, so when we talk about the portfolio management process, when we talk about managing a portfolio of assets, please remember that there are 3 steps involved. The first step involves planning. You always need to start planning as an investor. If you hold a portfolio of assets, the first and most important thing you need to do with regards to your portfolio is to plan. That's the first step of the portfolio management process. The second step is execution. How are you actually going to execute the plans that you've come up with in part 1? And the last step is feedback. How successful was your execution of those plans, and do you need to make any changes? So let's briefly discuss each of these steps. And then after discussing each of these steps, we'll look at them in detail. So the first step of the portfolio management process is the planning step. And the planning step involves 4 key tasks. Okay, so if you're an investor, whether institutional or individual, another important thing about institutional investors, right? If we're talking about a pension fund or a life insurance company, there'll usually be an investment board. For example, in a pension fund, there'll be what we call trustees, right? Trustees. And these trustees will be responsible for the portfolio management process, or appointing investment managers who will help them with the portfolio process management process. Individuals sometimes go to consultants to help them with this process, but we'll talk about all that as we go on. Okay, so anyway, back to what we were saying. So we were saying that the first step with regards to the portfolio management process, let's say you have money and you want to invest your money in a portfolio of assets. The first thing we need to do, we have to look at 4 key tasks. First of all, whether you're an investor or an institution, we have to identify and specify your objectives and constraints. You want to invest money, what are your objectives? Maybe you want to save up to purchase a house, you want to be able to save up for retirement, and so forth. Those are the objectives and the constraints. You might have to pay tax on your investments. You only have 3 years before you need the money. So those are all constraints. So we're going to look at all those. So the planning step involves 4 key tasks. The first task is identifying and specifying the investor's objectives and constraints. The second step is creating a very important document known as the investment policy statement. This document just writes out what your objectives are, what your constraints are, how you are going to try to achieve your objectives, and which assets you can invest in with regards to trying to achieve your objectives. And then the fourth step is formulating capital market expectations with regards to the assets you're going to invest in. And then the fourth step is creating what we call a strategic asset allocation. So this module that we are looking at in investment portfolio management, investment portfolio management, we're going to look at all these items. Don't worry, we'll look at some of these in learning units 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth. So we're going to go into detail into each of these, but this class that I'm taking you through now, I'm going to mainly focus on identifying and specifying the investor's objectives. That's going to be part 1. And then part 2 of the class is going to take you through the constraints, as well as explaining briefly on the investment policy statement. And then the later classes will look at formulating capital market expectations and creating the strategic asset allocation. Okay, so the planning step involves these 4 parts, right? And then once you've accomplished those 4 tasks, then comes the execution step. So this module is also going to look at the execution step in later chapters. So in the execution step, the portfolio manager integrates the investment strategies with capital market expectations to select specific assets for the portfolio. So with the first step, we're just planning. And then with the second step, we are now taking all of our plans and putting them into action by now appointing a portfolio manager, someone who will manage our money on our behalf, whether it's an institution, whether we are an institution or an individual, we'll usually have a portfolio manager. So the portfolio manager will now implement the plans that we came up in step one. So we're also going to talk about how those steps are implemented, the flexibility we give the portfolio manager of being able to deviate slightly from some of the plans we set, and how the portfolio manager goes about that. And then lastly, the third step, even though we've given a portfolio manager our money, we then also need to monitor how successful the portfolio manager has been with regards to actually achieving our objectives given our constraints. And maybe they need to rebalance our portfolio, maybe to change some of our objectives or our constraints, to look at the expenses associated with managing the portfolios. You see, sometimes we need to check the objectives and the constraints. Are they being met? Have they changed? How successful is the portfolio manager at actually implementing the strategies that we talked about before? And we also have to evaluate the performance of the portfolio manager so that they can be paid. So those are the three steps. So we're going to look at all these steps in this module. It's very interesting. By the end of the module, you understand the planning step in detail, how to identify and specify the investor's objectives, what an investment policy statement is, what formulating capital market expectations is, and what creating a strategic asset allocation is. And then you also understand the execution step and also the feedback step. So it's important to note that even though you are an investor or an institution is an investor, there will usually be a portfolio manager who will assist you with managing the portfolio. Okay, so it's not something that's done by one party. You might do it yourself if it's your amount of money, or you might find that other financial institutions like pension funds, they might decide to manage their funds themselves, but they're actually investment management companies who specialize on investing money on behalf of individuals, right? So part of the planning step might be done by the individual or the institution, and then the later parts of the planning step and the execution and feedback might be done by the portfolio manager. But it's an integrated process, and we'll look at how it actually works. Okay. So in summary, given the three steps I've stated: planning, execution, and feedback. In summary, we can summarize portfolio management as an ongoing process which has the following important aspects associated with it. So portfolio management involves investment objectives and constraints being specified and identified. What are your objectives as an investor, and what are your constraints? Remember, so we'll look at constraints like taxes, the time you have until you need the money, and liquidity. And then we also have to consider the strategy that you're going to use to try to meet your objectives given the constraints. And then we have to decide the types of assets we're going to invest in to try to meet your objectives given the constraints. And then the decisions are then initiated by the portfolio managers, right? And then implemented by traders. So you'll find that some investment management companies have portfolio managers and traders, like they do everything on your behalf. And then we also have to monitor the performance of these portfolio managers and of our strategy with regards to what we're trying to achieve. We also have to monitor the market conditions to see if it's necessary for us to be holding the assets we're holding, or if market conditions have changed and we need to change our holdings. And then rebalancing. If we were investing 40% in bonds, 60% in equity, we might find that we need to change that to 50% bonds, 50% equity to better meet our objectives and our constraints and so forth. So we will look at all those in detail. Remember, this is just study unit 1. So now what I want us to do, I now want us to look at 2 key tasks of the planning step. So in this first topic, this first learning unit, I'm going to take you through these two key tasks: identifying and specifying the investor's objectives and constraints, and creating the investment policy statement. So that's what we're going to cover in learning unit 1, right? And then in this particular class, I'm just going to finish off by introducing you to how you identify and specify the investor's objectives. And then in part 2 of the class on study unit 1, I'm going to take you through identifying the constraints and creating the investment policy statement, what the investment policy statement is all about. So it's a common question to come in assignments and in exams. So you need to be comfortable with identifying and specifying an investor's objectives and constraints, as well as the idea behind the investment policy statement. The investment policy statement is just a document that summarizes what the investor's objectives are, what their constraints are, the strategies we're going to try to use to try to achieve those objectives given the constraints and so forth. But we will talk about that. So let's start by identifying and specifying the objectives and the constraints of an investor. So we'll start by looking at the objectives. So this class is going to finish off by just looking at the objectives, and then the next class, which is part 2 of learning unit 1, we'll look at the constraints and the investment policy statements. Okay. So with regards to any investor, whether institutional or individual, we have to consider two types of objectives. We have to consider the risk objective. How much risk is an investor able and willing to take? How much risk is an investor actually able and willing to take, which will give us what we call the risk tolerance. Right? We have to state the risk objective. And then after stating the risk objective, once we understand how much risk the investor is able and willing to take, we then have to specify the return objective. What's the return that the investor is actually after, given the risk they are able and willing to take, which is the risk tolerance, right? So the risk objective limits how high the investor can set the return objective. If an investor can take on a lot of risk, like if an investor is able and willing to take on a lot of risk, it means that the investor is able to set a higher return objective. Okay. However, if the investor is not willing or able to take on a lot of risk, it means that we'll have to invest in asset classes with low risk, and the lower the risk, the lower the return, the expected return. So that would mean the return objective would be much lower. So before we can get to the return objective, we have to understand how much risk the investor is able and willing to take, and then the return will be based on the risk objective. So when we formulate the risk objective for an investor, we need to address some key questions. Question number 1, we want to identify how much risk the investor is able and willing to take, but how are we going to measure that risk? We can measure that risk using a number of statistical methods known as the variance, standard deviation, tracking error, or value at risk. In later study units, we're going to look at the tracking error and value at risk in detail. You might be familiar with the variance and standard deviation from statistics, but for the purposes of this module, for now, you don't have to know too many details about that till later on. For now, you just have to know that these are some methods that you can use to measure risk. After we've decided how to measure risk, we need to ask ourselves, what is the investor's willingness to take risk? Now, to identify how willing an investor is to take risk, let's say I'm an investment consultant, or and I'm trying to understand how a client of mine, how willing a client of mine is willing to take risk. The way we can do that is we can ask some questions, maybe through interviews and discussions. So to determine the investor's willingness to take risk, we have to have discussions and interviews with the investor. For example, you might sit down with a client and the client might say, I'm very cautious and I don't like taking risks with my money. So we would then see that the investor has below average willingness to take risk. They tell you. Or an investor might say, no, I've always been someone who likes to invest in new asset classes like Bitcoin and so forth. I'm always prepared and willing to take that risk. So that investor would have above average willingness to take risk. And then another investor might just say, with regards to my willingness to take risk, I'm just average. I'm not too keen on it, and I'm also not against it. So as a consultant, you have to ask the client and have interviews with them, sit down, talk to them, and then you can try to see psychologically how willing they are to take risk. And then the third point is more a matter of fact. Now, the third question you need to ask is, what is the investor's ability to take risk? Now, the ability to take risk with regards to an investor depends on their spending needs, their financial strength, their long-term wealth needs, and their liabilities. You might find that if you have an investor who has very low spending needs, they don't have a lot of money they need to spend regularly. They have a lot of financial strength. They have a lot of money tied up in cash. They are very secure. They have very little liabilities, very little expenses they're spending money on or need to spend money on soon. And they don't have any immediate needs in the short term or long term occurring. That would mean that this person is really comfortable and they are able to take on a lot of risk. However, you might find that another person has a lot of spending needs, a lot of liabilities, a lot of expenses, rents, mortgages, paying up off a car. They don't have a lot of money. Their financial strength is very, very limited. And they have a lot of needs, immediate needs and long-term needs. So a person like that might not be able to take on a lot of risk because of their own circumstances. So the ability to take on risk depends on some key factors. So as a consultant or a portfolio manager, you would need to better understand the investor. Where do they stand with regards to, to their financial strength? Do they have a lot of cash available? Like, do they have a lot of expenses they need to meet regularly? So that then determines how able an investor is to take on risk. So there's a difference. There's a willingness to take on risk and an ability to take on risk. Just because you are willing to take on risk, it might not mean that you are able to take on risk. Usually people who are able to take on risk will be wealthier, will have spending needs which are far less compared to the amount of wealth they have. They won't have any major liabilities coming up soon. Like, for example, they won't be approaching retirement soon or any other milestone. A person like that will usually have an above average ability to take on risk, whereas a person who is not very wealthy, is maybe approaching retirement or has a lot of expenses, that person might have below average ability to take on risk. So once we've identified an investor's willingness to take on risk and their ability to take on risk, we can then combine those two to determine what the investor's risk tolerance is. So the whole idea between assessing how willing and how able an investor is to take on risk is for us to determine what the investor's risk tolerance is. So to determine the risk tolerance is a bit tricky. It takes a lot of practice and it's a question that comes up a lot in exams and assignments. You'll see we'll do a question as we finish this class just to illustrate how that would actually occur in practice. But I've created a table here that can guide you. It can try to guide you with regards to how best to identify the risk tolerance of an investor. We'll look at an example. We're going to look at an example to show you how this happens at the end of the class. And then in the next class, I'll also look at more examples from the workbook, just so you become comfortable with this. This is a very common question in exams and in assignments, okay? So if an investor's ability to take on risk, remember the ability of an investor to take on risk can be classified as below average, average, or above average. And an investor's willingness to take on risk can be classified as below average, average, and above average. If the ability to take risk is below average and the willingness to take on risk is also below average, it means the risk tolerance of the investor is below average. If the investor's ability to take on risk is average and their willingness to take on risk is also average, it means that their risk tolerance is average. If the investor's ability to take on risk is above average and their willingness to take on risk is also above average, it means their risk tolerance is above average. And then sometimes we have mixtures in between. Willingness to take on risk below average, ability to take on risk average, and then it means the risk tolerance is average to below average. Willingness to take on risk is average, ability to take on risk is below average, risk tolerance is average to below average, and so forth. So this table can act as a guide, but we will look at examples. Willingness to take on risk is average, ability to take on risk is above average. So risk tolerance is average to above average. So try to familiarize yourself with this table. It's just a guide. You would actually need to see an application of how to determine risk tolerance through a proper example. And that is something that we will do at the end of this class. And then the fifth question we can ask with regards to the risk objectives. What are the specific risk objectives? This is similar to the whole idea of determining the risk tolerance, but it just goes into much more detail, looking at value at risk and other factors. Don't worry too much about that. And then lastly, the sixth question, how should the investor allocate risk? This involves a process known as risk budgeting, we'll touch on later on. And for the purposes of this class now, as we introduce you to the planning step, it's not too important, okay? So remember, we said that with the planning step, the first thing we need to do, we need to specify the objectives and the constraints. I've just taken you through how to formulate the risk objective. I now want to explain to you how to formulate the return objective. So remember, the formulation of the return objective determines on how you formulated the risk objective. If you're prepared to take on a lot of risk, then you have flexibility in having a higher return objective. However, if you're not prepared to take on a lot of risk, then you don't have the flexibility of setting a high return objective. So when we also look at the return objective, there are certain questions we need to ask. There are 4 key questions. Question number 1, how are we going to measure the return? Remember, when it was the risk, we asked how are we going to measure risk? We also have to specify how are we going to measure return. So usually we measure the total return, but what's more important is that for this module, when we specify returns, we usually classify them as nominal returns and real returns. So a nominal return on an investment would be a return that hasn't been adjusted for inflation, whereas a real return would be a return that's been adjusted for inflation. So for example, you might invest money and you might be told that you will receive 10% as a nominal return. And then you might be told after adjusting for inflation, after removing inflation, your real return is actually just going to be 6%. So that would mean that once we've specified the nominal return, the return you would earn on an investment, we also have to consider inflation to get the real return. Okay, so it's important whenever whenever you are told about an investment to consider whether the investment is quoted as a nominal rate of return or as a real rate of return. A real rate of return would be the actual rate of return you receive after adjusting for inflation. So that's important. We'll look at some questions as to how to calculate those two, but usually a simple way to do it would be to just take the nominal rate, and then let's say maybe inflation is 4%, and then if you subtract those two, you get the real rate. This is a simplified way of doing the calculation, but there's also a complicated approach, but the simplified way would be fine. And then you also have to distinguish between pre-tax returns and post-tax returns. Sometimes when you're doing an assignment question or in the exam, you might be asked to calculate the return objective after tax for an investor. So we might look at all the investors' needs in the future. We might look at their capital base, and then we might want to find out what return they would actually need to achieve after tax to be able to have enough cash to meet all their needs in the future. So we're going to look at an example involving how to do that just after explaining all the key questions to ask with regards to the return objective. And then the second question is, how much return does the investor say he or she wants? So this would be the stated rate of return. So an investor will have what they would want. Like an investor might say, I would want to achieve a 12% return over the next 5 years. That's what I would want. But like we saw with the investor's willingness to take on risk, what you desire is not always what's possible. So after considering what the investor would desire, we then actually have to determine what does the investor actually require. What you require and what you desire are two different things, okay? The required return is like the minimum return you require to be able to meet all your needs, whereas the desired return is what you would want. So a person might have a desired return of 12%, but they might actually just require a return of 9%. Usually a person's required return, what they actually require to be able to meet all their liabilities, is usually far less than what's actually desired. So to actually determine what's required, we actually have to do some calculations, whereas what's desired can simply be a matter of a prospective investor telling you what they would need, okay? And then the fourth question is, what are the specific return objectives? So now, when we now get to the final return objective, just like the risk objective, we now have to factor in what the investor requires and what the investor has said they desire. And then we also have to consider the risk tolerance of the investor, given their ability and their willingness to take on risk. So for example, an investor with a 5% after-tax required inflation adjusted annual rate of return, but above average risk tolerance, might reasonably set a higher than 5% after-tax inflation adjusted annual rate of return objective to maximize expected wealth. So when we finally state the return objective, we have to look at the risk, the total risk tolerance of the investor, and then we also have to look at what their required return is and what they desire to come up with a final number, which would give us the return objective. Okay. So just to finish off the class to help us to better understand these concepts we've been covering, I just want us to finish off by looking at a case study where we have to formulate the return objective and also to calculate the required return, as well as to formulate the risk objectives. Okay, so this is a past assignment question. I think it came in 2016. In 2020, there was a question similar to this, but it contained a lot of errors, like it had a lot of mistakes, so I didn't want to use that question. I thought to use something from the older assignments, which doesn't contain errors compared to the more recent, compared to the more recent assignment question, which seemed to contain errors in 2020. So we're told that there's Fortune Chiriro. So I'm just going to go through this, just highlighting the important concepts. Fortune Chiriro, age 60, will retire in 5 years from now as a marketing manager of Ego Armor management company. At retirement, she will receive 500,000 tax-exempt lump sum from a retirement savings plan and 80,000 and an 80,000 rand taxable cash payment from EAMC. Upon her retirement, she will also receive 5 million as proceeds from the sale of shares in EAMC. Her original investment in EAMC was 1 million. She has a daughter, Rungano, who will be attending university in 5 years' time, and she's going to pay all expenses associated with this 3-year undergraduate education degree with her own funds. And she anticipates that the first year's expenses will be 135,000 payable in 4 years' time, and these will increase 4% annually at inflation. She has a money market fund that is currently valued at 1 million, earning 4% annually. As part of the community engagement, she's going to donate 120,000 rand annually beginning in 5 years from now. Her current after-tax salary is equal to her current living expenses of 200,000 rand annually. Her and her daughter reside in a 1.2 million house, and she's going to give this to her daughter on her death. She's taxed at 25% on salary, benefits, and investment income. Assume capital gains are not taxed in South Africa. She wishes to maintain the purchasing power of her investable assets. Her living expenses are going to grow annually at a rate of 5%. And she's expected to live for 20 more years, given her family's retirement. Okay. She's a CFA, and she's approached the CFA to help her with financial advising. During the meeting, she admitted to having little knowledge about investing. She also said that she views the money market fund as a way to safeguard the wealth that she has worked so hard for. And she has failed to take advantage of potentially attractive investment opportunities because she was not certain of the outcomes. She describes herself as being conservative in most of the decisions, except for the situations where she believes to be in control. And then we want to formulate the return objective in her investment policy statement. And we also want to calculate the after-tax nominal rate of return that is required to achieve this objective for the first year of retirement. So remember, we said that if we are stating the return objective, we have to first state what she desires and what she requires. And then we combine what she desires and what she requires to get the return objective. And then we also have to factor in risk, and we also have to factor in how we are going to measure that return. Are we going to use nominal rates, after tax rates, or before tax rates? So given this case study, we've been clearly told that she desires to earn a rate of return that is sufficient to maintain the real value of a portfolio, to maintain the purchasing power of her investable assets. So this is her desire. And then she's also got other required expenses, required needs. She's also got other needs that she'll be required to meet. For example, meeting her daughter's expenses when she retires. Remember, her daughter will start school as soon as she retires. Meeting the annual charitable contributions of 120,000, which she'll start paying when she retires, and also meeting ongoing living expenses during retirement. So 5 years from now, we can actually write down the inflows she's going to expect to receive. She's going to expect to receive a retirement saving, right, of 500,000. Okay, so I've stated the return objectives. I'm now at calculating the after-tax nominal rate of return. She's also going to receive interest income from the fund. Okay, remember we've been told that she's invested money in a money market fund, which is earning 1 million annually, right? So she's also going to receive this amount as part of a money market fund, okay, which is 40,000. And then she's going to sell some of her shares. So if we say 4%, 4% of 1 million gives us 40,000, right? And then she's also going to sell some of her shares, giving us 5 million. We've also been told she's going to sell some of her shares, 5 million when she retires in 5 years' time. So these are all expenses that are going to happen at the beginning of the year when she retires. She's going to get some money from her retirement savings, some interest income from her fund. She's going to sell some of her shares, and then she's also going to receive a retirement gratuity of 80,000. So if we add all those up, that gives us the total inflows. And then we can get the outflows. She's going to pay tax on the money market fund and the retirement gratuity. So in other words, the tax is 25%. So if we say 25% of 80,000, which is the retirement gratuity, plus 25% of the interest income, we get 30,000. So we say 25% of the retirement gratuity, 25% of the interest income from the money market fund. This gives us the tax. She has to pay for her daughter's education. Starting from the year she retires, that will be 135,000. We've been told it's 135,000, but it will increase at 4% each year thereafter. And then the donation to charity is going to be 120,000 for the first year. And then if we add all that up, we get the total outflows. And then if we take the total inflows, right, minus the total outflows, that gives us the net additions and withdrawals. Okay. And then we can now look for the inflows which are going to occur at the end of the first year of retirement. So we also have to look at the inflows that are going to occur at the end of the first year of retirement. So at the end of the first year of retirement, she's just going to have to pay again for the education of her daughter. So this 135,000 Rand, this 135,000 Rand is going to increase by the inflation rate for the education. I think we were told that it's 4%, right? So that gives us 140,400. And then the donation to charity is going to occur again, that's 120,000. And then the living expenses. Now, the living expenses are increasing at a rate of 5%. Okay, so these living expenses, we assume that the payment will be made at the end of the year, so we've just written it once. So we can take the current living expenses and then we can increase these by 5% over 6 years. So we've taken it to 6 years because we are currently at time 0. And then time 1 is going to pass year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and then we're going to get to time 5. So we're looking at what's happening during this year, what's happening during the 6th year. So we're calculating the living expenses as at the end of the 6th year. So we're taking the current living expenses multiplied by 1 plus inflation to the power 6, and then that gives us the living expenses amount that's going to be needed. So the basic idea here is that we are going to have a capital base of this amount. We're going to have a capital base. Actually, let's just double check here. We're going to have a capital base, right? We're going to have a capital base of 5,335,000 plus the 1 million, which is the current money market fund. So it means the total amount of money that we're going to have when this lady is going to have when she approaches retirement is going to be 6,335,000. This is the total amount of money that she's going to have. This is the net cash flow we've calculated from income and outflow. And then this is the funds that she currently has in a money market instrument. And then we've also seen that given the outflows and inflows that are going to occur over the end of the year, she's going to end up spending 528,419. So this is going to be the total amount of money going out as a result of the education, donation, living expenses over the course of the year. This is at the start of the year, and this is over the course of the year up until the end of the year. So we can divide the money that she's going to need up until the end of the year, calculated in this column, divided by the asset base. And then that gives us the required after tax real rate of return. This gives us the required after tax real rate of return. So it's after tax because we removed the tax expense, and it's the real rate because we haven't factored in inflation, right? So to get the required after tax nominal rate of return, like I said previously, we take our real rate, which is what we just calculated, and then we add inflation. So this amount of money, this capital base of 6,335,000 has to earn 13.34% so that this lady, Chiriro, so that this lady can meet all return objectives, so that she can meet all her return objectives and also protect herself against inflation. So that's what this 13.34 means. Okay, so this is something that can come up in assignments and in exams, so I just hope you follow that. In 2020, there was a question sort of similar to this in 2020 assignments, but I wouldn't advise you to use that. That question had a lot of errors, and even the solutions, there was a lot of questionable things in that assignment, so I decided to use this one from 2016. And then lastly, as we finish off the class, we are asked to evaluate and justify each of the three components of the risk objective in Chiriro's policy statement. Remember, we look at three items when we look at the risk objective. We look at the ability to take risk, which depends on the liquidity needs, the capital base, the time until the funds will be needed. We also look at the willingness to take on risk, which we gather when we listen to what the investor actually states and talks about. And then we combine the ability to take risk and the willingness to take risks to give us the overall risk tolerance. So here we're told Chiriro has an above average ability to take risk because she's got a long time until her retirement, including a life expectancy, and she also has a very large asset base. So usually the asset base, this is 6 million. She's got a lot of money to work with. So that means she's got a very, very big asset base, and she has above average ability to take on risk. If her asset base was very small and she didn't have a very long expected lifetime until retirement and so forth, we would say maybe she has below average ability to take risk. And then a willingness to take on risk is below average because she said that she's conservative and she's someone who likes to only make decisions if she's in control. She also doesn't want to risk her money losing its purchasing power parity. So willingness to take risk, you listen to what the investor says, like what does he talk about, what does he talk about, and then you come to a consensus on what the willingness to take on risk is. We're going to look at some examples in the next class from the prescribed textbook to help you to better understand this. So it will make more sense as we do more examples. So we classify as having below average ability to take on risk. So Chiriro's overall risk tolerance is below average because she's clearly risk averse. She doesn't want to take on risk. When faced with uncertain outcomes associated with investing, her current conservative investment preferences, both stated and implemented, outweigh her ability to take risk. So this part to do with the ability, willingness, and overall risk tolerance is a bit subjective. Two people can come up with different conclusions. So I did try to create this table. I think we were told she's got above average ability to take on risk, and she's got a below average willingness to take on risk. So this is where a resolution would be needed. I think it would be more conservative to just assume that the risk tolerance is below average if we get something that falls under resolution needed. I think to be safe, we would just assume that the risk tolerance of the investor is below average, because there will be some form of risk aversion, some form of wanting to avoid risk if you are not willing to take on risk. And then obviously, even if you are willing to take on risk, but your ability to take on risk is below average, we should assume you have a below average risk tolerance, because you don't have the money to be able to take on risk. So I'm going to look at some questions from the prescribed textbook in the next lesson. I'll take you through the constraints, the important constraints when we're formulating an investment policy statement. And then we'll look at maybe 3 or 4 case studies where we are asked to specify the ability to take on risk, the willingness to take on risk, and the risk tolerance, and some explanations as to how the decision is arrived at. And then we'll also analyze how the constraints are factored in with regards to the investment policy statement and the other components of the investment policy statement. Okay, so that brings us to an end of the class. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that the class has been helpful and you've had a very productive introduction to the module. Any questions or queries with regards to anything covered in this class, please feel free to let me know on the number up on the screen. I won't always be able to get back to you promptly, but I'll try to do so as soon as I can. Thank you very much for listening.